as I lay dying." Dhal walks through the room to the back of the house. There he meets his father, Ans, and Vernon. They ask after Jewel, and Dhal tell them that he is tending to the horses in the barn. Outside, through Jewel's perspective, we are told that he thinks it is improper for Cash to be building their mother's coffin right outside of her window. He is hurt that the other members of the family would let him do this. He wishes that he could be alone with his mother in her last days. This is revealed out loud by him in the next scene when he rails at his brother, father, and Vernon for seeming to want to hurry along in her death. Vernon has hired Dhal and Jewel to make a delivery for him, but their father is reluctant to let them go. He worries that they will not have the horses back in time for Eddie's death, and thus he will have no transportation for her body. Ans finally agrees to let the boys go as long as they promise to be back before the next day at sundown. After this is settled, the boys go to bid their mother farewell. Cora watches and is touched by Dhal's kind words to his mother. The boy's sister, Dewey Dell, looks on as well. The narrative then shifts to Dewey Dell. Dewey Dell is thinking about a harvester named Leif whom she slept with, secretly. Dewey Dell thinks that she knows that Dhal has found out about this. Dhal tells his sister that he feels that their mother will die before he returns, but that he needs Jewel's help loading the wagon, so he is taking him anyway. Vernon continues to try to convince Ans that Dhal and Jewel need to make the trip. Vardaman, the youngest child of the Bundren house, comes back with a large fish that he intends to show to his mother. Ans instructs him to clean the fish before bringing it in the house. Cora and Vernon head home for the evening. Ans tells us that he is convinced that the new road that the government put next to his house has brought nothing but bad luck, and he blames it for his wife's sickness. Dhal and Jewel depart, and Dhal thinks about how he confronted his sister after finding out that she slept with Leif. He attends to Eddie and finds her unable to move but not in particular distress. Dewey Dell tells Peabody that his mother wishes him to leave. That night, Eddie dies. Somehow, Dhal and Jewel feels this even though they are miles away. Ans tells Cash that he needs to finish up the coffin as soon as possible, and then tells Dewey Dell to make dinner. After his children leave the room, Ans stands over his wife's body and strokes her face once before leaving. Somehow, Dhal and Jewel feel this even though they are miles away. Ans tells Cash that he needs to finish up the coffin as soon as possible, and then tells Dewey Dell to make dinner. After his children leave the room, Ans stands over his wife's body and strokes her face once before leaving. Dhal tells Jewel that he feels their mother is dead. Upset, Vardaman runs out of the house and begins to cry. He feels that Peabody is responsible for his mother's death and wishes to punish him. He finds a stick and begins beating on Peabody's horses until they run away. After which he sulks in the barn, alone. Upset, Vardaman runs out of the house and begins to cry. He feels that Peabody is responsible for his mother's death and wishes to punish him. He finds a stick and begins beating on Peabody's horses until they run away. After which he sulks in the barn, alone. Dewey Dell thinks about her night with Leif Moore and reveals that a pregnancy has resulted from it. She considers asking Peabody to abort the child but thinks that he would not agree to do so. Dewey Dell makes dinner for her family and then, not feeling hungry, decides to go out to the barn to find Vardaman. When she does stumble across him in the barn, she has been saying Leif's name softly to herself. She accuses Vardaman of spying on her and shakes him violently by the shoulders before sending him away. Dewey Dell makes dinner for her family and then, not feeling hungry, decides to go out to the barn to find Vardaman. When she does stumble across him in the barn, she has been saying Leif's name softly to herself. She accuses Vardaman of spying on her and shakes him violently by the shoulders before sending him away. Outside, Vardaman stares at the coffin his mother will soon be buried in. He feels uneasy that she will be nailed inside of it. Outside, Vardaman stares at the coffin his mother will soon be buried in. He feels uneasy that she will be nailed inside of it. Upset, Vardaman runs to Vernon and Cora's house to inform them of his mother's death. Vernon and Cora bring him back to his house and Vernon begins to help Cash finish the coffin. At dawn, they finish and place a day in the coffin before nailing it shut. Later that morning, they return to find that coffin board full of holes and Vardaman lying asleep next to it. Vernon and Cora return to their home. Cash sets to work fixing the holes in the coffin. The family has laid a day in the coffin backward to accommodate the flared bottom of the dress she was buried in, wedding dress. The town's minister, Whitfield, arrives to perform the funeral rites. Anse notes that Eddie wished to be buried in Jefferson and that he wants to get her there. The funeral is held and afterward, Vernon and Cora leave to go home. On the way, they come across Vardaman fishing in a barren bog. They tell him that there are no fish in the box but he insists that his sister has seen one. Jewel is angry at Dahl for causing him to miss their mother's last moments. Dahl wonders how Jewel can still be angry about their mother as she does not exist anymore. Jewel and Dahl return home after some delays and they and Cash and Anse lift the coffin onto the wagon. The family prepares to take the body to Jefferson. Jewel is still angry about missing Eddie's death while Vardaman is still upset about it. Cash brings his toolbox on the trip so that on the way back they can drop him off at Vernon's place for work. Anse tells his son that this is disrespectful. He becomes even angrier when Dewey Dell brings a cake of Cora's to deliver in town. The family drive all day and eventually reach the farm of a man named Samson. They find that the bridges are all flooded and that they cannot leave town. Samson offers to shelter them for the night. The next morning, the family attempts to find another way to cross the river. Eventually, they stumble across Vernon, who helps them cross a dangerous sunken bridge. Dahl observes Jewel's sullen behavior and thinks about a time years earlier when Jewel began sleeping at odd hours. He and Cash noticed that Jewel was sneaking away from the house at night and assumed that he was spending time with a married woman. One night, Cash followed Jewel, but when he discovered the boy's secret, he refused to share it with Dahl. A few months later, Jewel bought a new horse. Dahl discovered that his brother had been spending his nights clearing land on another farm so that he could get money for the horse. Ans was angered by the new mouth to feed, but Jewel assured him that he wouldn't have to take care of the horse. Dahl remembers how his mother defended Jewel and covered up his wrongdoings. Dahl, Cash, and Jewel did not cross when the rest of their family did and end up stuck on the wrong side of the river with the wagon and the coffin. After some arguing about how best to cross, they eventually decide to cross as they normally would with the wagon. Unfortunately, a large log comes at them too fast and upsets their progress. Ans's mule drowns and the brothers struggle to maintain the wagon without it. Watching from the shore, Vardaman panics that his mother's coffin will wash away. He yells at his brothers to maintain hold of it. Eventually, Cash manages to get ashore although he is unconscious. The brothers, Ans, and Tull make an effort to gather everything that was washed out of the wagon. During this chaos, the narrative shifts to Cora, who is thinking about Eddie. She remembers a conversation she had with Eddie about religion. She worried that Eddie was putting more faith in her thankless son, Jewel, than in God. She remembers that Eddie spoke about Jewel being her cross and her salvation in a way more fit for someone talking about God. The next monologue we are shown is Eddie's. The book never makes it clear whether she is meant to be speaking from beyond the grave or if we have been taken back in time to before she died. Eddie recalls working as a schoolmistress before her marriage. She took pleasure in whipping the children when they acted up. She then remembers her tense courtship with Ans and their marriage. She relates that after she gave birth to her first children, Cash and Tull, she felt as though her solitude had been taken away. Her marriage suffered during this time and she participated in an extramarital affair with the town's minister, Whitfield. Rather than making her feel better, however, the relationship only made her disillusioned that someone who claimed to be so virtuous could engage in something so sinful. Eventually, she became pregnant with Winfield's bastard child and gave birth to Jewel. After this, she gave birth to Dewey Dell and Vardaman from Ans and thought of their lives as final payment in her emotional debt to him for being unfaithful. She then remembers some of Cora's words about salvation and sinning and thinks of them as empty and meaningless. Just at this moment, Whitfield himself suddenly decides to go to the Bundren house and confess his decades-old affair with Eddie to Ans. He assumes that the woman will want to confess it herself on her deathbed and means to beat her to the punch. However, upon reaching the Bundren household, he finds that Tudi is already dead and that the house is empty. Whitfield decides that this must be a sign from God and leaves the house without looking back. Back at the river, Dahl lays Cash on top of their mother's coffin so that the family can keep moving in the damaged wagon. The Bundrens arrive at the house of a man named Armstead. Armstead offers to let them stay for the night and they insist on sleeping in his shed. Jewel skips dinner so that he may tend the horses. Armstead offers Ans the use of his team of mules, but Ans declines. Jewel rides away to find the doctor, Peabody, but is only able to find a veterinarian. The veterinarian is able to set Cash's broken leg, regardless. Cash faints from the pain. The next morning, Ans takes a horse to town to see about purchasing a team of horses from himself. Vardaman insists on guarding his mother's coffin and fights off a gang of buzzards that are circling near it. That evening, Ans returns to announce that he has purchased a team of horses. He confesses that he had to use some money from the fund he was saving to purchase false teeth for himself, as well as money from Cash's savings and trading Jewel's horse. Initially, Jewel is shocked, but his shock quickly turns to anger and he rides away on his horse to keep it from being traded. Without the horse to trade, the deal is in danger of falling through. However, the next morning the farmhand that Ans made the deal with arrives with the horse. He tells the family that he found it unattended on his property. With their horses leading the way, and without Jewel, the family set out again to Jefferson. Vardaman watches as more buzzards circle overhead as they drive. In the town of Motson, the family stop to rest and shop. A shop owner named Mosley takes over the narrative. Mosley sees a young woman in his shop and asks her if she needs assistance. The young woman, Dewey Dell, hints that she is trying to obtain an abortion and Mosley is flustered. Angered, he refuses to provide her with treatment as he is a religious man. Dewey Dell insists, saying that Leif told her the drugstore would give her an abortion for $10. Mosley continues to refuse the request and suggests that she ought to marry Leif. After Dewey Dell leaves, Mosley's assistant tells him more about the Bundren family. Apparently, the father was seen having an argument earlier that day with the local marshal about the stench of his wife's week-old corpse, and one of the sons was buying some cement to set his brother's broken leg. The family leaves Motson and soon Dahl stops the wagon in front of a house to request that Dewey Dell runs up and ask for a bucket of water to create a cast for Cash. Dewey Dell obliges. Cash is slowly bleeding to death from his injuries. Dahl and Dewey Dell create a cast for his leg from the cement. As they are doing this, Jewel returns and wordlessly gets back into the wagon. That evening, the family decide to stay at another farm for the night. Dahl sets the coffin up against an apple tree. Cash's leg begins to swell because of the heat. Vardaman and Dal go out to check on the coffin in the night. They decide to move it into the barn for safety. Later, Vardaman spies Dal setting fire to the barn. Vardaman tells Dewey Dell what he saw and she advises him not to tell anyone. Because of the hot, dry night, the fire quickly becomes a blaze. Everyone gathers to watch the fire and Jewel attempts to free the horses and mules from the barn. When he is successful, he goes back in for the coffin. Vardaman looks at the burned remains of the barn as the coffin is successfully dragged back to the apple tree. Cash's leg has since turned black from the amateur cast. Ants makes an attempt to break it open. Jewel has also been wounded by the fire. The next morning, beaten and bruised, the family still decides to continue to Jefferson. They make it to the town that day and Dal suggests that they see a doctor about Cash's leg before burying Eddie. However, Cash insists that he can wait. Ans stops at a nearby house and asks to borrow a shovel. The family finally bury Eddie soon after. Cash's narrative reveals that the night before he and his father had agreed to commit Dal to a mental institution. It turns out they know he caused the fire and the family that had given them the barn to use is threatening to sue if they do not have Dal committed. With no choice, they agree. That morning men from a nearby institution show up to take Dal away. He fights against them but his family helps to subdue him. Dal finally breaks and sits on the ground, laughing. As the book ends, we're taken through a few different narratives to note what becomes of the characters. Peabody tells us that he treated Cash's leg, but that the man may never walk again. At the Jefferson drugstore, a clerk named McGowan sees a young woman enter and finds her attractive. He pretends to be a doctor as she asks for an abortion. The young woman is Dewey Dell and McGowan tells her that she will need to come back later and see him in the cellar of the building. She does so while Vardaman waits on the curb outside. After she emerges from the store, she leads Vardaman back to their hotel while mumbling to herself that it will not work. Dal is taken into an institution and rants madly to himself. He begins to switch back and forth between the first and third person as he continues to have a psychotic break. Ans finds out that Dewey Dell still has $10 and asks to borrow it. Though she forbids him, he takes it anyway and leaves the hotel. The next morning as the family prepares to return home, Ans comes back with a set of new false teeth. Cash remembers the night before and how his father spent more time than he considered necessary in the house borrowing the shovels. When Ans comes back he is accompanied by a stern-looking woman. Ans introduces the woman to his children as the new Mrs. Bundren.